My interest in the issue of media images of Africa and peoples of African origin began in 1979. I went to a conference on images of Africa in the media at Michigan State University. And the presenters all described these educational films in horrible terms. They essentially said that the educational films, and these are the films shown in public schools and I assume private schools all over the United States, they're the films distributed by the major distributors of educational media. Essentially, they said that these films depicted Africa in an inaccurate and negative manner. Africa was depicted in a very stereotyped manner. And there were overgeneralizations about Africa, like Africans live in villages, Africa is hot and humid, African natives don't wear clothes, such things as that. Now, I thought that this was really kind of an exaggeration. It didn't seem reasonable to me that in 1979, when most of Africa was independent and had been independent for almost 20 years, that U.S. schools should be teaching those kinds of images of Africa. It just seemed impossible. So I said, well, maybe these people are exaggerating or overemphasizing this in order to make a point. Well, that's what I thought. And then I started to look at the films in the video library of an urban public school district with an extremely multicultural population in an area that prides itself on its sensitivity to cultural diversity. I assume that the films that the people had been talking about at this conference were films from some kind of remote place in the United States where there was not this kind of cultural sensitivity. Well, I went to this public school district and I began to look at their films on Africa, and I was mortified. I was mortified by the fact that all of the problematic stereotypes that the presenters at this conference had talked about were well exhibited in these films. All of the language, natives, primitive, that was just a standard word, Africans are primitive. Not meaning the first, meaning of simple technology, backwards. That one film talked about the indigenous society in terms of the bondage of the past and contrasted it with dreams of the future referring to westernization, essentially. I mean, it was very difficult for me to imagine that this school district was teaching about Africa in that kind of way. There were films that were old, and you could say, okay, fine, these are films that were made before awareness. Maybe they were made in, say, the 60s, if we can be a little charitable. One day, I had viewed some of these films and came out of the viewing room kind of looking very bizarre. And I saw an administrator from the school district, and she said, well, what's wrong? And I said, these films are horrible. And she said, oh, well, we have some new ones. Why don't you look at them? And I said, I just finished looking at one of the new ones you just got. It's horrible. And it wasn't horrible in exactly the same way. Obviously, the cinematography had improved, but it said things like, this man is the richest man in his village. He makes $20 a year. $20 a month, I'm sorry. What do you think of that? Now, what is any American school child going to think of the fact that this man only makes $20 a month and he's considered wealthy? That this place is just dismal. They forgot in the film to mention that if this man is the richest man in his village and he makes $20 a month, perhaps he doesn't need much money. Perhaps he grows all of his own food. Perhaps he is self-sufficient in other kinds of ways. And so money is really not the essence of his lifestyle, but they forgot to say that. The camera focused with amazing regularity on bare feet. Now, is there any sin to not having on shoes? No, this is a warm climate. People don't need to wear shoes all the time. But what was the camera saying? They didn't need to say, these people are primitive. Look, they're going to church with no shoes on. The message is already transmitted to the students subtly. These were films made in the late 70s, made and distributed and bought by school districts with taxpayers' money in the late 70s. So I decided to take the images from Africa to the Americas. And I wanted to see if there was any similarity of presentation between Africa and descendants of Africa in the Americas. I looked at the few films on the Caribbean and South America. Those areas were just underrepresented. I think there were 2 films on the Caribbean. In one, the essential message was, the Caribbean is a terrible place unless you're an American tourist, and then it's wonderful. A white American tourist. preferentially, according to the images. I mean, the film was dull, but the emphasis was all on how hard life is. Now, I'm sure someone must have a decent life someplace in the Caribbean, but you could never get that impression if you looked at the films in this series. I mean, in this school library. Interestingly, in the same series as the terrible film on Zambia, there was one good film, and it was on Jamaica. And it was from a we point of view, in which a Jamaican was actually speaking. Now, that was very rare. Most of the films were just boring, and perhaps they didn't convey too many negative images to students because they were probably turned off by that dull male narrator voice right from the beginning. But this film on Jamaica was so charming. I mean, it had a different voice. It had an accent. And it was from a we perspective, and it talked about what we like about our life in Jamaica. And the narrator said, you know, we have some problems, of course. You know, everybody's got some problems, but we have a wonderful life. That film was such a breath of fresh air in a generally dismal, amazingly dismal visual curriculum. And when we consider that, where do we learn about the world from? From images, not from reading. I mean, particularly this generation watches television, sees more images than it reads. And so if the kinds of negative images from television and the commercial media are reinforced in a compulsory manner in school, then what kind of image of the world is it possible for any American students to have? African American and Euro American. The African American students are clearly encouraged to disidentify with Africa and other people of African origin outside of the United States. And Euro American students are given this false sense of superiority. There was one wonderful film for the purpose of talking about what's wrong about Brazil, called Brazil, the Vanishing Negro. This was a film done in the late 60s, and it was a public television film. And essentially, what the film's purpose was to talk about the way in which Brazil had resolved the racial problem much better than the United States. And the film did this in a very interesting manner. They showed these people who were allegedly of African origin, but it was imperceptible. And then they showed these people, and it talked about the fact that these people, although of African origin, had no problems in Brazil. Of course not. Now, the film kind of undid itself when it would show people of clear African origin, and they would talk about the fact that they had had major experiences of racism, because that's the nature of that society. But the conclusion, or the message of the film was essentially that Brazil had resolved the racial problem better than the United States by its policy of breeding out African character traits. And so if you visible Africanisms, the way of getting rid of the racial problem was to get rid of the people who were the problem, essentially by breeding them out. So there was that. Now, what kind of image of the world is this? And they were consistent. All of the images were like that. There was one other breath of fresh air. Excuse me, I can't just talk about the negative, but the positives were so infrequent. There were 3 films out of 7 made by an African-American production company called Nguzo Saba Films. And what they did was a film on each of the 7 Swahili principles: creativity, kumba, faith, imani, and the others. And these 7, of which there were 3, are wonderful. They're animations, and they're just wonderful. But there were only 3. And that was such a breath of fresh air out of maybe the 50 that I looked at. I didn't look at all of them. I didn't think that it was necessary to be entirely depressed or entirely revolted by the fact that the school district, someone made those films. Okay, the filmmakers obviously had a point of view and they had a worldview. But someone bought the films. Somebody in that school district was in charge of choosing the good educational materials, I assume. I assume that they didn't say, well, we'll just take anything you have on Africa. Another wonderful film for teaching a certain kind of worldview was called South Africa Black and White. And it began with the line, this is a line it's impossible to forget: when the Dutch arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, they found no one there but some naked nomads, ignoring the fact that there were a lot of human beings who already lived in the area, but some naked nomads, just dismissing the entire population of Southern Africa. And I was talking to a South African friend who said, yes, that's exactly the way we learned history in South Africa. So essentially what this film was teaching was white South African history of South Africa, which is predicated, obviously, on the oppression of all of the Africans who lived there in the first place. So this film would be wonderful. It didn't mention apartheid. It didn't mention oppression of any sort. It just talked about how everyone lived well in South Africa. The film would be wonderful if it were juxtaposed with another film on South Africa that presented a more realistic perspective. And there are films like that. There have been films like that for a long time. There was no such film there for balance. So a teacher with a critical mind and enough knowledge to go beyond her or his own education could have used the two films to say, well, this is one perspective, what do you think of that? And this is another perspective. Now, allowing the students to get some sense of the fact that you can use images to create a certain kind of reality, to convey a certain kind of reality that isn't necessarily everybody's reality. So that, I mean, I was astounded. And I asked an administrator if I could, why they had those films. And she said, oh, the teachers know these films are bad, so they just don't use them. I wanted to use that film as illustration for a workshop with teachers of how bad things were. It was being used. Now, I like to think that it was being used in a critical manner. But given that when I did this workshop with these teachers and I showed them other films that were totally denigrating with respect to Africa, the teachers didn't see any problem with them. Why didn't they see any problem? They have been educated to think that that's just true. And they've also probably been educated to think that, well, if these are the materials that have been chosen for us, experts have chosen them, and therefore this must be the accurate version of this reality that they are portraying. And so all we have to do is teach this reality to the kids. I mean, it's reasonable for the teachers to think that. Unfortunately, if they want to present an accurate worldview, they have to disabuse themselves of this illusion and take upon themselves a responsibility that they really shouldn't have to take on. But if they want to do if they want to contribute positively to the educational process, they do have to take it on. They have to become themselves. They have to go beyond the education they've been given and understand that a lot of the images that we're shown of African peoples and peoples of Africa and of African descent are negative. And I was trying to think, well, how could these teachers who say haven't been to Africa, haven't been to the Caribbean, have themselves grown up on these stereotypes, have learned that they should, African-American teachers, for example, should disidentify with Africa? What can they do? Well, the simplest thing they can do is to ask themselves, if they were the people being portrayed in the film, how would they feel about the portrayal? Would they notice that it was negative? And I think that if they could just do that simple exercise with any film that they were to get, then they might begin to look at the films in a much more critical manner, just by virtue of putting themselves in the place of those people who look very much like them in the films. Let's see, one of the things that I've tried to do with that information is to share it to the extent possible. And I've written a report about these images. And with some colleagues, we are trying to create some positive images. Not overly positive images, just accurate images. And we've done a film on Brazil, for example, because we think that it's useful for African Americans to get some sense of Afro-Brazilian society and culture, because they are very much like us in some ways and very different from us in other ways. Brazil is very much like the United States. It's a large country, multi-ethnic. It's got lots of industry. There are very underdeveloped sectors in the society. Not all of the members of those underdeveloped sectors of the society are Afro-Brazilians, but they are overly represented. But whereas African Americans have a sense of we're all the same, we are all black, we are all of African origin, in Brazil it's different. They have their social system says that, well, if you're dark black, you're one thing, if you're light black, another thing, so there's no basis for cohesion. However, whereas we have a sense of unity, they have a sense of Africa, because they have maintained so much more African culture than we have in the United States. And so I think that we, in looking at them, can get a better sense of how much African culture we have actually maintained that we don't recognize as such. And they seem to me as a wonderful link between us and Africa, so that we can see African forms in an already Americanized version with which we can identify much more easily than with the original African form. And so that's an example of what I've been trying to do in response to this overwhelmingly bad visual educational media that's out there.